So it's good to be here. My name is Gene Walker. I am, I guess, the newest member of the committee.
Yeah, along here.
One of the newer. That's it. I'm also the executive director of Mission C, which is a nonprofit here on the north side that works with tenants who are facing eviction. And so this financial education piece is just kind of one of the things that I do and that I'm passionate about. And my hope is that today will be more of a discussion than a lecture, if we can pull that off. Although I tend to just kind of ramble and talk through stuff. But feel free, if you have questions, you don't have to raise your hand. You can just kind of like start talking and I'll hear you and stop. But if you want to raise your hand and be formal, you can. See if that's working. No, turning it on might help.
One thing, just so you know, we've talked about being able to develop a resource bank, so we are recording today. So any question you ask is reserved for all attorneys. No question.
As long as they don't force me to listen to the recording, because there's something about my voice on recording that I'm not a fan of. But let me give you a rundown of what we're going to do while we're waiting for the rest of the food. As always, we should open in prayer, so we will do that. And then I pulled a scripture reference that I think can be a good guide for us as we think about how we manage and steward the resources that we have in our differing communities, but also in our personal lives. And then I'll go through the 4 topics that I was told we wanted to talk about. So let's start with prayer and then we'll get moving. Gracious God, we thank you for the opportunity for this commission and these new worshiping community leaders to get together to talk about how we best steward the resources and gifts that you've given us. We pray, Lord, that during this time that you would bring questions to mind that would help us to do better and be better at the things that you've called us to do. That we would take these lessons and add to our knowledge base so that as our communities grow, as our church grows, as our networks grow, we can bring those lessons and teach others. So for that, Lord, we give you praise and honor and glory, and we let you take the wheel of this conversation because in all things you drive and we follow. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. All right, so I promise I won't preach because that's not what I'm here to do. But when I think about how do we manage our finances and how do we budget and how are we responsible stewards, this series of verses comes to mind. So I will read it. It's from Matthew 25, 14 to 29. It's probably a very familiar verse, but I don't know how many people actually stop and talk about it too often. But these are the words of Jesus starting in verse 14. It says again, "It will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his abilities. Then he went on his journey. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 more bags. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. 'Master,' he said, 'you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more.' His master replied, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness.' The man with 2 bags of gold also came. 'Master,' he said, 'you've entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I have gained 2 more.' His master replied, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness.' Then the man who received 1 bag of gold came. "Master," he said, "I knew you were a very hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. So here is what belongs to you." His master replied, "You wicked, lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I did not sow and gathered where I did not scatter. Well, then you should have put my money in deposit with the bankers so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. So take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags, for whoever has will be given more, and they will have abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them." So I read that, right, and it's like kind of crazy powerful as I think about how do I think about personally, how do I manage the resources that God has given me to take care of, whether it's my personal finances or my business finances. And then when I think about our communities and our churches, God has given us a really big responsibility. He is, the master who has left us with some treasure based off of our talents. And it's our job to manage them properly, and then when he returns, to give him something more than what he's given us. So let's let that guide us as we have this conversation. How can we best steward the resources that we have, control them, manage them, take care of them, use them effectively, so that when we are asked to give account, we have more than what he started us with. Sound good? All right. So now we're just off to the... Did I turn it off again? No, there we go. So we're really just going to talk about the basics. So if you look at the agenda, there are 4 items that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about understanding the basics of budgeting and just kind of the really just high level. What's involved? What is a budget about? Why do we need to do it? We're going to talk about projecting for the future. So now that we know how to budget for now, how do we even think about what next year or 2 years or 5 years down the road is going to look like? Because that can sometimes be hard. We'll talk about just some of the basics of how do we then, once we have this plan, like what are the basics around the bookkeeping part? The actual kind of writing down of our transactions and accounting for those things, which isn't always the most fun. And then we'll talk about just some controls that we can put in place in our communities and in our life that can make sure that the things that we are doing are both ethical and moral, but also good and healthy, because that is important. There's nothing that gets us in so much trouble as not taking care of our money well. So there are lots of elements to a basic budget, but I want to ask you a question. Why do we even need to budget? Like, what's the point? Anyone want to venture?
Bad memory.
Bad memory. Absolutely. We think we can remember everything that we did or wanted to do.
It ensures you're putting your money where your mouth is. You say you're about one thing as an organization, you have a mission, you have a purpose. But if you look at your budget, is that really what you're putting your money into? You can tell a lot about an organization's real purpose by looking at their budget.
Absolutely. Yeah, so your budget tells you where your priorities are. And right, you can say your priorities are one thing, but if your budget says something else, that can cause a problem. And so ideally, right, those things will link. The things that we tell ourselves we want to do are reflected in how we're spending our money and using our money wisely. That makes a lot of sense. And so you can think of that both from a church community, but also from a personal standpoint, right? If you look at your personal household budget, does it reflect your greater priorities, or are you letting things sneak in there that are taking away from your ability to do things that you want to do? So there are lots of benefits to an effective budget. A budget, now I joke, right? Budget sometimes gets a bad rap, just like the word diet does. And that when you think of those things, right, if you think of your parents saying you got to get on a budget, the first thing you think about is all of the things that you can't do. Just like when you think about dieting, you think about all of the things that you can't eat. I like to think about it differently. I like to think about a budget as allowing me, through planning, to do everything that I hope and dream I can do, while making sure that I don't lose track by focusing on stuff that doesn't matter. So when I budget, I can focus on the things that are really important, and I won't let those shiny things that show up out of the corner of our eye get in the way by distracting me from what I'm looking to do. So a budget really allows you flexibility and control. Because when I look at my budget and that shiny thing pops up, I can say, wow, that's really nice, but right now, if I want to get to point B, I have to leave that alone. Budgets allow us to know where our money's coming from and where it's going more effectively. So a budget is not something that you write on the first of the year and then stick on a shelf somewhere. A budget is something you write on the first, and then you look at it on the 15th, and you come back to it again on the 20th, and you do this over and over. It's a living document that should move and grow with you. It's not some static thing that you can't mess with. So there are times when you budget something and you realize, I didn't quite put enough money in that category, but I really need to do this thing to make my vision happen. And a budget will allow you to look at another area that maybe you don't have as high a priority, and you can kind of move things around a little bit. So you have flexibility to do more as long as you've done the work ahead of time to put the budget together. Budget allows us to plan for growth and for the future. So as we look at a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 5 years from now, today's budget will help drive what we're able to do down the road, because we can begin to see what works and what doesn't work. We can begin to see how our decisions are impacting kind of the balance sheet, and what are the changes we need to make in that decision-making process that will allow us to begin to plan for those things down the road. So budgets are a really powerful tool. I talked about how they're a living document, and then we talked about how they just help confirm our priorities. And so if you see someone that is about missionary work, but their budget doesn't have any missionary budget money, are they really about missionary work? Yes.
May I suggest one other bullet point for your list? It's a great list.
Absolutely.
But I think they also help us to gain trust through accountability, because having a budget helps the people inside the organization have faith and confidence in the leadership team and in the mission, and also outside funders have more trust and confidence in the work of the organization when they know there's a realistic budget.
Absolutely. That is a great point, and thank you for adding that. Hopefully someone write that down for me so that I can remember it. But yeah, that's a great point. I mean, at Mosaic, we vote on our budget annually and then get an update partway through the year as a trust and accountability piece. And we hold our elders and our treasurer accountable for areas where spending is off, right? But we hold our congregation accountable when revenue is off, right? So it's like, we said we wanted to do these things. We're doing our part by managing it properly as a congregation, right? We have to feed that through our faithful giving. Yes, that is great. Thank you for that. So there are some elements of an effective budget that will that you'll want to keep in mind. So an effective budget is going to take into account all of your areas of ministry, whatever those are. The ones that you have now and the ones that you hope to do down the road that you may not have the capacity to do now. So there is a scenario on your budget where there'll be zeros around categories because you just don't have the resources or the time or the infrastructure to do that. But without it there, you can't think about it as you go along. So I want to make that point. They also take into account all the ways that money comes in to the organization, to the community. And so that could be money from the presbytery, it could be giving from the people that attend, it could be grants that you may apply for, if that's something that can happen. So you need to take into account all of those things. So in my nonprofit, right, I think of grants, corporations, and individuals. Those are my three pockets of outside revenue, and then I think about any services that I might provide. And I need to take account of all of those things, and all of those numbers have to start matching so that I can do my mission. And it's the same thing in the communities. All of those things have to start. You have to start hitting those target numbers, and you should have kind of aspirational targets for those things so that you can adjust your plan. You can have those conversations. I don't know if you've ever been in a church that doesn't talk about giving. It's an interesting idea to never talk about giving. Mosaic doesn't talk about giving a ton. Like, we take an offering, but it's not like, I don't think Salim's ever preached on giving more than once in 8 years. It's an interesting thing. But on the other end, you have churches that's all they talk about. I don't know which one's best. That's up for you to decide. But we have to talk about where the money's coming from in order to make the money come in. It doesn't just magically show up. There is no magic in this. An effective budget is going to lead and guide all of your decision making. And so where that discipline comes in, right? That new mission that pops up that you just fall in love with, but it's just not right in your priority, your budget will help you not get distracted by that thing. Now, you may want to help it personally, but from a worshiping community standpoint, right, you have to be steadfast in making sure that you don't get distracted. So the budget will help those decisions. Then your budget will also help you grow. So as you get more comfortable with the processes that we'll talk about, it will help you begin to see more clearly, to focus more clearly. And then as you grow, ideally you want to begin to look at your budget both for today and what you might need down the road. So as you build the organization, you don't want to create something that will just work for a small community, right? You want to think about, well, can this process, can this activity, can it expand, and can I use it when there's 50 people, 100 people, 500 people? By then you're not a community anymore, you're full-blown, whatever. But those are kind of things to think about. Sometimes we limit ourselves by creating something that only works for now. And what we want to do is we want to create something that both works for now, but something that I don't need to change a year from now when my situation has changed. I can just adapt and add more columns and more rows and let it grow organically. But it's also not a one-size-fits-all. So what works for one may not work for you. How you do the bookkeeping isn't standard. You can ask any accountant. There are general rules, but there's no two companies that look alike. They may have some similarities, but there's always going to be nuances. So you have to do what works for you and that you're comfortable with. And if you're not comfortable with it, then it's important to bring someone in who is comfortable that can help you to do those things. It could be an actual accountant, or it could be just someone who's better and more comfortable with those things. Are we good to keep going? All right. So here's my advice. Keep it simple. We're not Fortune 500 companies. We don't need 5,000 policies and rules. We just need a handful that will help make sure that we don't make mistakes, that we stay accountable, and that we do the things that we're looking to do. So the first thing you should do and think about is finding a tool that can help you manage the day-to-day stuff. So there are lots of them. You could use a spreadsheet, and I provided a blank one. This is actually Mosaic's spreadsheet. I just took all the numbers out. But this is how Mosaic budgets on an annual basis. And so what you'll see, there's a couple of components. You'll see, so this is what we voted on for 2019, but you'll see a 2018 budget. You'll see a 2018 actual. And so that actual number changes. The budget number doesn't, but the actual number does. And then you'll see a 2019 projected or budget. And then this year, they'll just add the columns over, and so it'll say 2019 budget versus 2019 actual. And so the actual number changes so that you can see where you are in comparison to what you thought. Yes?
Is this what you're looking at on a monthly basis, so the year-to-date column, or do you break it out further, so anticipated, projected month?
Yeah, you can break it off. So I think this main one is really a good tool for just updating the year-to-date. I will suggest in a little bit that you manage two budgets, one for the year and one for the month that you're in, and I'll talk about why. But sometimes it's easier to look at just what's happening today and then put it into the grand scheme, but you don't want to lose track of that budget kind of number that you have for the year, because it's easy if you take too narrow of a view to lose sight, and then you wake up one day when you're reconciling and go, oh my goodness, we spent $500 too much in this area, and now we have to adjust. So what I really like, spreadsheets are fine. Some people love spreadsheets. Mosaic uses spreadsheets because Salim likes spreadsheets. Some people just use pen and paper and like a check register. It was funny, I was at CMU not too long ago, and I said something about balancing my checkbook, and the kids looked at me like I had 4 heads. So I had to explain what a checkbook was and a check register. I prefer using computer software. So there are lots of them out there. I reference Quicken because you can get a free version. If you want to pay a little bit more for it, then you can get access to linking it to your bank account so that every day you go in and you just hit update and it sucks in all of your transactions. You can actually create a budget form in there and then hit print as you go along. So that's my preferred method. That's what I use at home. I have accountants at work who do that stuff, so they come up with all these fun things. And then the last step, you can use kind of a combination. So if you like paper, but if you like to write it down, but then you want to put it down in the computer somewhere or in a spreadsheet, you can do those things. You're not bound by one method. It's just a matter of what's most comfortable. But even more importantly, you have to pick the one that you'll actually do. So when we think about all of these different things that we can do, it's most important that you pick the one that you'll actually sit down and take the time to do. It doesn't matter how great the technology is. If you won't do it, it's not great for you. And then the last thing is it'll help you, the basic budget will help you determine where your areas of focus are. And so those may change from year to year, maybe even from quarter to quarter if you look at it in 3-month increments. But it really helps you to focus in. One of the other things that I don't know if I put this down there, but it helps you have those conversations with the people that you're working with. So the people in your community, having something that you can show them and walk them through and talk through, like these are our priorities and this is where our money is going. I think it's a really useful tool. So if you ever show up kind of the first or second week of the year when we're voting on our budget, like people get nitpicky. Like, why is there $275 there this year, but only $150 there this year? And I'm like, but it makes sense. All right, and again, you want to make sure that you include all of your ministry areas. It's better that you budget for something and don't spend it than to not budget for it and need it. So it's always better at the end of the year to say that I didn't spend as much as I thought than it is to say I spent way more than I should have. And
Share this with our kids.
I can. Yeah, I just did this like a week ago. I had a big event, 150 some kids. Yeah.
So, I mean, I agree with you, but that also can be a red flag if you budgeted for something and then didn't spend it. Because did you say this was really important to the church, and was there a reason for that? And then you just didn't do it. Is that indicating you're not, doing the ministry that God has called you to do, or did you, fall off in your passion for this, or it's a question to take a look at those areas.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. No, you're okay. So we were joking earlier about Enneagrams, and I'm more of a predictive index guy, and my predictive index says that I don't like structure and rules. And so I'm okay, even in the context of this, to be all over the place. And then I think I mentioned this earlier, but make sure that you plan in areas, even if they don't get a budget amount each year. And so there may be a year where you say, hey, we're going to have a retreat. Well, you may not do that retreat every year, but it should be in there to reflect that that's something that's important to you. Yes?
So, and we might not get here today because this might be a little bit more nitpicky, but we were talking at Commonwealth about ways to quantify resources that are not financial, so volunteer hours, or, because it's another way to show your priority, right? You may not have put money towards it, but if you put 50 volunteer hours towards it, that's a big deal. Is there a way to do that on a basic budget like this, or should that be kept separately and then integrated to present publicly? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I don't know if it necessarily goes on a financial budget. It could be a kind of a notation, and then you just have some sort of volunteer report that you report out to that says that we did this much community service. Now, you could put, I guess, in there where it doesn't calculate, we want to do 200 hours of volunteer service each year, and then you can track it on there and have it in one place. But yeah, that's a good question. I think you can be flexible with how you track that. But if you want to track it numbers-wise, if there's like a target number, then it doesn't hurt to put it on there. Just have it off as a side note that says volunteer hours committed, volunteer hours completed. That would make sense. Absolutely.
So calculate it separately, but maybe on the same form so you can see it all.
Sure, absolutely. So we started to talk about this earlier. I'm going to suggest that you use two budgets, one for the annual to give you the big picture, and then one that you use monthly, and they will feed into each other. But the annual budget drives your monthly budget, not the other way around. Right? You lose control when you let the month-to-month stuff drive what you do annually. You want to think, and I heard this just this morning, it was really interesting. Gentleman was talking about how does he write a book, and this guy writes 1,300 page research books. And he said, the biggest thing that I learned is I need to know the final sentence before I can write the book. And so if we think about our budget and our annual budget as the final sentence, then we can go back and write the rest of the book as we go along, knowing that there's some flexibility and wiggle room. But you kind of have to know where you want to end up so that each month you can stay on track. Does that make sense? Yeah, podcasts are the greatest find I've had in the last couple of years because you just learn such interesting stuff. But the annual budget drives everything. Because month to month, as your expenses may change or as your revenues may change, you need to make adjustments on the fly, but keep it within the confines of the bigger picture. And how far you want to go out with your budgets is up to you. I think a year is great for most. But if you're starting to grow and starting to think about what happens down the road, then you may want to project out 2 years or 3 years, because the further out you can get that final sentence, the better you are along the way to plan those things out. Oops. So yeah, monthly budgets can vary, because just like in our personal lives, in our ministry, like every month is not created equal as far as our expenses. So in the winter months, there just may be a little bit more money spent on heating and utilities than there are in the summer, if that's something that you're going to track. Obviously, in the summertime, in the spring, and the fall, you may spend more time doing stuff out in your community than you would in the colder months, so you can account for those things. And I certainly do that in my life, and it makes sense in business and in church as well. So if we start thinking about the future, where are we going to go? We want to look at some key things. Now, it helps to have kind of a year under your belt sometimes before you start planning too far in the future, because when you're new and you're just getting going, you don't know what you don't know yet. And so you kind of have to make those, it's trial and error. But once you have a kind of a good idea, then you can start asking questions. How closely did my revenue projections meet what I thought? And if we didn't bring in enough money, what happened? How do we avoid that? Because like many things, without enough money coming in, we're not able to do the things that we need to do. If we brought in more money than we thought, we just had a really great year, then we can start thinking about what are the things that we did to bring in the money that we did, and then how do we, can we replicate that? Or was this kind of a special thing that happened? And if we can replicate it, how do we do that over and over again? Because if we brought in more, then we can budget more for next year. If we find that it's just one of those one-offs, like just somebody came through town and liked us for a little while and gave us a bunch of money and then they left, because that's what they do sometimes, we have to take that into account. Like, can we expect that to come in annually, or is it just a one-time thing? And then we have to think about, what do we want to add? Like, what are the things that we weren't able to do this year that we now want to be able to do next year? And do we have the resources available to do those things? What are the changes that we need to make? So now that we've seen a little bit of history, what didn't we like that we were doing that we can change? What did we really love that we want to continue doing? And so any of these discussions, we want to encourage the things that brought us joy and helped us, gave us life and kept us moving, and we want to de-emphasize those other things. Now, there are some things that we don't like that we just need to do. I don't want to assume that if I don't like budgeting, I don't need to do it anymore. Like, we still need to do some of those things. What areas did we think were going to be a priority that aren't, and we just don't want to do them going forward? What areas did I feel challenged? Do I feel challenged by God to pursue in the next year that I wasn't able to do this year? I think this is one of kind of the big areas that I think about is, and this is kind of a caveat, because usually the things where God is challenging us, we can't see in our actual budget and our resources how it's going to happen. So we have to take that into account. We have to take into account that God's going to ask us probably to do something bigger than we can see possible. But I want to put those in the works. So I don't want to get into a position where I'm like, I'd love to do that, God, but I'm going to wait until I see a pathway, because that just makes things hard. So I'm going to say, God, I don't know how this is going to happen, but I'm going to put it here, and I'm going to put a number by it, and then we're going to pray like crazy to figure out how this thing works. So we want to think of this is a little bit different, well, not too terribly different than what I do day to day. Question? No? Okay. As we talked about earlier, like you're going to find areas where you budgeted too much or you budgeted money that you didn't spend. So the question is why? What caused us not to spend that? Was it just because it turned out to not be as big a priority as we thought? Or, the worst case, did we just not do the things that we were supposed to do? And so those are two very important questions. Did we not do it because it wasn't important, or did we just not do it and we should have? And so you're right, those can be red flags. Sometimes they can be good. Yes?
I just want to add a layer to that because this happened to us often when I was planting, which is like we didn't spend money on it because somebody showed up as sort of an angel donor to cover it just this one time. And then we thought we could take it out of the budget, but you can't actually do that. Like there is a cost to the organization. It's just somebody funded it just this once.
Yes.
And so like leaving a placeholder even when it doesn't show up as money that you spent.
Yeah, and so when we're doing a review, you know, that's a good point to bring up. Hey, we budgeted $1,000 for this, but somebody came in, like we had the $1,000, but somebody came in and took care of that need this year. That's a good thing. But yes, conversely, next year you go, well, Angel's going to come back again, and Angel doesn't show up again, and now you're like, what happened? What areas did we under budget? Where did we miss our target on the low end? So we just didn't have enough resources available. And those same two questions come up. Did we spend too much because we got distracted? Or did we just not place high enough priority on that thing so that we can make a decision on what to do going forward? And so when I talk about your budget being living, this is what I'm talking about. Just like your personal finances ebb and flow based on your decisions, your community and church budgets ebb and flow based off of the decisions that you make. And so we have to look at the causes. Yes?
Sorry, another question about that is what, in this kind of work, I'm wondering what areas we should expect to go up a little bit each year, sort of as cost of doing business. I'm thinking of personnel, maybe like rent. And I don't know what else that would be, but it occurs to me that some of this is like you have to build in a
Sure.
like close up thing. Maybe we don't have taxes really, but
Yeah. So when I think through my budget at Mission C, and we think about what is going to happen, and we just did this a 5-year projection, which is a little scary for a brand new organization. But what is a reasonable amount of increase for employee expenses? How long can Gene do this by himself before he then has to hire someone else, which is going to raise it? We run an event once a year. What does that event look like? How much do we expect it to grow? All of those things, yes, you should take into account as things change and shift. You have someone on staff who tells you at the end of the year, I'm not going to stay. Then the question is, do I keep that in my budget for the next year, or can we get through the next year without replacing that person? Can we kind of shift those responsibilities? Those are all like really important questions. Thank you for bringing that up, Karen. So yeah, in anything, whether you spent too much or didn't spend enough, or even if you spent exactly what you thought you were going to spend, you should ask those questions. What caused me to get here? Do I like what caused me to get here? And if I don't like what caused me to get here, what changes do I make? And then if I liked how I got here, do I want to keep doing what I'm doing, or do I want to try to expand a little bit more? Those are really important questions. If you have children, your children will ask you why all the time. And as a parent, you get tired of your children asking you why. But why is like a hugely important question. So I will thank God for having my kids ask me why a lot, even when it was annoying.